There's a passage in a small sutta where the Buddha says something very important. He says the Dhamma is nourished by two things. One is commitment, and the other is reflection. You commit to doing it, you reflect on the results of your actions, and the implication is if the results are not good, you figure out what to do differently. And that way you learn. And the Buddha is saying several important things here. One is that your actions do make a difference. Sometimes we hear that we have no free will, that everything is determined by our genes or our past karma. But the Buddha never taught that. He taught that everything comes from the mind. And the mind can be trained. It can change its ways. So we're going to take advantage of that ability. We're acting in ways, speaking in ways, thinking in ways that cause suffering, but we don't have to. We can change our ways so that we act and speak and think in ways that bring an end to suffering. The second thing the Buddha is saying is that basically the Dharma is a skill. If you think about any skill that you mastered, whether it's cooking or carpentry or a sport or music, you commit yourself to doing it as best you can, and then you reflect on the results. You observe what you're doing, you observe the results, and then you make improvements based on what you've observed. So the Dharma is not just a body of knowledge that you can read about and discuss. It's meant to be put into practice. We think about the Ajahns in the forest tradition, and one of the reasons we respect them is because they were really good at commitment and really good at reflection. They committed themselves totally to the practice of the Dhamma and reflected in a very wise way on how they practiced. So they didn't get misled by the various side roads that you can encounter as you meditate. Ajahn Suwat, my teacher in America, said that when he was staying with Ajahn Mun would focus on two topics again and again. One was the principle of practicing the Dharma in accordance with the Dharma, and the other was practicing the customs of the noble ones. Practicing the Dharma in accordance with the Dharma, of course, means that you try to change your behavior to fit in with the Dharma, rather than trying to change the Dharma to fit in with your preconceived notions. You try to adopt the values of the people who have practiced the Dharma. And this is what the customs of the noble ones are. There are two passages that discuss what it means to customs of the noble ones. One is one tells the story of when the Buddha returned home after his awakening. And the very first morning he went out for alms. Now he'd been born as a member of the noble warrior caste. Noble warriors don't go for alms. And so his father came up to him and said, "How can you do this? This is disgraceful. Nobody in our family has ever done this before." And the Buddha said, "I'm no longer a member of that family. I'm a member of the family of the noble ones. This is one of their customs. They find their food, clothing, and shelter from gifts that are freely given. Warriors, as you know, take what they want. The noble ones receive what is freely given, live off of some things in the world, and are content with things in the world based on what they get." This connects with the second passage where the customs of the noble ones are discussed. That's where the Buddha says there are 4 customs that typify the customs of the noble ones. The first 3 have to do with being content with your food, clothing, and shelter. Whatever you get in terms of food, clothing, and shelter that's enough to practice, it's enough. You don't have to struggle to find more. At the same time, though, you don't pride yourself over the fact that you are more content than other people. As he says, you watch out for the dangers either of discontent or the dangers of pride as you use things. So you use them wisely, you use them for the sake of training the mind, and then you learn how to let them go. The 4th custom, however, is not being content with medicine. If you know anything about the 4 requisites, that's the 4th requisite. But here the Buddha says the 4th custom is learning to delight in developing and to delight in abandoning. You delight in developing skillful qualities of the mind and delight in abandoning unskillful qualities. This is the opposite of what most of us do. We delight in our greed, aversion, and delusion. And the Buddha says, no, you want to learn how to delight and figure out how not to be slaves to these things. In other words, you're not content with the state of your mind. If you see anything unskillful in the state of your mind, you do what you can to change it, to improve it. So you content yourself with material things so that you can focus your discontent on developing the mind. The Buddha said at one point that the secret to his awakening was that he didn't rest content even with his skillful qualities. If they hadn't gone all the way, he wanted to try further. This is why he, after mastering the skills he learned from his first 2 teachers, he said, this is not good enough. There must be something better. After he tried starving himself for 6 years, saying that this is not getting anywhere. Even though he developed a lot of persistence and a lot of endurance, still it wasn't the right path. So he had to go beyond that. And it was his willingness to find, okay, what further development of his skill was possible. That's what allowed him to become awakened. And so these are the principles that inform the forest tradition. As I say, Ajahn Mun in particular made himself entirely into Dharma through his practice. But he didn't just follow the instructions, he also reflected on the results he was getting and learned to adjust his actions accordingly. One of the principles that Ajahn Lee talks about, having learned from him, is that when you gain an insight, you ask yourself, to what extent is this insight true, and to what extent is the opposite true? So you don't just be a one-eyed person. You look at things that, this is very true, it seems very convincing, but you have to ask yourself, what are the limits to this knowledge? What are the limits to this insight? So you don't get carried away with a particular insight. You learn to reflect in an all-around way. Ajahn Mahabua talks about times when he was staying with Ajahn Mun. He was very strict about observing the Tudanga practices, the ascetic practices. And one of them is not accepting food that comes after your alms round. And so that was one that he would hold to during the rains retreat. But he noticed that every once in a while Ajahn Mun would come and slip a little food into his bowl and say, these people came a little bit late, have some pity on them, accept their food. He didn't too many times, just a couple of times, but just enough to point out, okay, watch out for your pride. There's a good side to this practice, but there's also the side of pride. Watch out for the pride. That way you can benefit from what is good in the practice. So we respect the forest Ajahns both because they committed themselves totally to the Dharma, the practice, and because they were wise and circumspect in their powers of reflection. Of course, they encourage us to do the same thing. If we want to benefit from the Dharma, if we want to nourish the Dharma in our hearts, first we have to commit to doing it. We're not just here to learn about it, to discuss it. If you're going to listen to it, you commit to listening carefully. If you think about it, you commit to trying to figure it out and see how it makes sense. Question things that don't make sense. But then the real commitment comes in actually putting into practice. It's meant to be done. And we have to think about, if you think about the Dharma not so much as a philosophy, it's more recommendations for how to act so you don't have to suffer. It's all about action. So you look at what the Buddha talks about. He talks about generosity. When you're being generous, he says, give where you feel inspired. But if you want to develop it as a skill, you start thinking about other things instead of just where I want to give, but also what would be a wise thing to give, who would be a good person to receive my gift, what's the right attitude I should have as I give, what's the right motivation I should have. And in that way your generosity becomes more and more of a skill. So try to approach your generosity in a wise way. The same with the precepts. You really commit yourself to following the precepts. The big one, of course, is the one against lying. It is so easy to misrepresent the truth. And you can give yourself all kinds of excuses. I don't want to hurt that person's feelings, or this person might get upset if they hear about what's true. But then you have to realize, okay, if you lie to that person, if you misrepresent the truth, at some point they're bound to find out. In which case they realize they can't trust you. And the value of your words gets lessened. And so you want to look at your words, how can I express the truth in a way that is not harmful, but actually does not deviate from what the truth is? That's a challenge. The Buddha's not giving you precepts because they're easy. He admits, okay, it is hard to observe the precepts, but it is possible. It's meant to stretch you. There's some people who say, well, the wise approach to the precepts is to know when to observe them and when not. That's what everybody does across all over the world. What the Buddha is basically saying is that you hold to the precepts and you find the wise way to hold to the precepts. And you think, in a circumspect way about how to speak, how to act, how to think. One time back in America, we were discussing how to deal with ants in the house and how to get rid of the ants without killing them. And at the end of the discussion, someone said, well, this has been a very profound discussion we've had this evening about ants. And I had to argue. I said, yes, it is profound. You think carefully about the beings around you. What can you do to live with them in a way that you're not harming them and also you're not allowing them to take over the house? And that requires some skill, it requires some insight. So you commit yourself to doing the practice. It's the same with your meditation. When the Buddha talks about developing mindfulness, the three qualities he talks about are mindfulness, alertness, ardency. Mindfulness, of course, is keeping things in mind. In this case, you keep in mind that you want to keep the mind with one topic, like the breath. Alertness, you're actually watching what you're doing. The wisdom there is in the ardency and trying to do it well. You're not just here to sit with whatever comes up. When things come up, you ask yourself, if I follow this, where is it going to take me? If it takes me to an unskillful place, I've got to change. I've got to change my focus, I've got to change the way I'm thinking about it. How do I do this well? That's where the wisdom is in commitment. You commit yourself to trying to do this as well as you can. When Ajahn Lee discusses the establishing of mindfulness, he focuses on these three qualities. He says the wisdom quality is there in the ardency, your desire to do this well. Because you realize that the Buddha is talking about things that you can do, things that you can change in your behavior so that you don't have to suffer. So no, we're not just here to talk about things or to see things coming and going. We're to see if something is coming, if I follow it, where is it going to take me? Does it take me to where I want to go? If it doesn't, I've got to figure out some way to counteract it. And then how do I develop qualities that will take me in the direction I want to go? So mindfulness is not just being okay with whatever comes up. When the Buddha himself talks about mindfulness as what he calls a governing principle, if there's something skillful in the mind that's not there yet, you try to give rise to it. Once it's there, you try to maintain it. In other words, keep it from passing away. So there's this active side to mindfulness, and it's in being proactive, seeing this active side and following through. That's where the wisdom is in this aspect of your practice, which is the commitment. And then you reflect. We were talking about reflecting at the end of the day. You don't wait to the end of the day. You reflect on your actions while you're doing them, and you see: are these actions getting the results I want? And you want to make sure the results you want are harmless. And then you reflect on them. And here, this applies to your practice of the precepts, your practice of generosity. Once you've given something, you reflect, okay, did I give that wisely? Was that a wise gift? Did I give the right thing to the right people? Did I have the right attitude? One of the ways you know that your attitude is not right is you give something to person X, and then person X gives it away to somebody else. And you get upset. And you say, wait a minute, if one monk is giving it to another monk, I should enjoy the fact that that monk is not greedy, that he's willing to be generous as well. This is one thing that as a monk you encounter again and again. You receive something from someone and they tell you, this is what you've got to do with it. That's a sign that they haven't given it up. So when you give something, you give it up. And then you look at the state of mind that results. You see, okay, this is a much more open, generous state of mind. This is what I'm trying to develop. So you commit to the practice, then you reflect. The same thing in the meditation. You focus on the breath, whatever your topic is, and then you reflect. Am I getting the results I want? If I'm not getting the results I want, what am I doing wrong? You change the way you breathe, you can change the way you focus, change the perceptions you hold in mind. Think about this method of breath meditation that I've been teaching. Ajahn Lee discovered it when he had a heart attack. He was off in the jungle. He had walked in for 3 days. And he was in his 40s at the time. He was not young. And he walked in, and then 2 or 3 days after he arrived at the place where he was going to spend the rains, he had a heart attack. No food that would be helpful for his heart attack. He was living with hill tribes. And the main diet for the hill tribes is bamboo shoots. And if you know anything about traditional medicine, bamboo shoots is the worst thing you can have if you have a heart condition. No medicine, all he had was his breath and the power of his mind. So he used that. He found out by working with the breath energies in his body, he was able to put himself back together again, so that at the end of the 3 months he was able to walk out. He continued having heart disease and he died 8 years later, but he used the breath to keep himself going. And again, that was taking what he had and reflecting on what are the results I get from this. And then if the results are not good, then you use your imagination. This is one of the aspects of the practice that is undervalued, is using your imagination. How else can I perceive the breath? How else can I perceive whatever my topic is? That would get better benefits. And it's through your own ingenuity in observing the results and then figuring out ways to improve. That's how your meditation develops. That's how your practice develops as a whole. Even when things go well, the question is, are they good enough? The mind settles down. Okay, be with the mind that has settled down. All too often people say, well, what's next? What's next? What's next is staying. See how well you can stay and see what issues come up that make it hard to stay. And that way you begin to see, these are some defilements I wouldn't have noticed otherwise. But the fact that I'm trying to keep the mind still as I go through the day, trying to keep it centered. This is where the Buddha recommends that you combine the practice of meditation with sense restraint. The image he gives, there are 2 images he gives. One is of a man with a bowl of oil on his head. The bowl of oil is filled to the brim with oil. He's walking between a beauty queen on one side and a crowd of people who are excited about the beauty queen on the other side. And behind him is a man with a sword. And if he spills a drop of oil, the man's going to cut off his head. And so is that man going to let himself get distracted by the beauty queen? Is he going to start distracted by the crowd? No, he's going to focus on the bowl of oil. So in the same way, as you go through the day, you focus on the state of your mind. How is my mind right now? Try to keep it balanced and steady. And the way you do that, the Buddha explains with another analogy, which is you have 6 animals. You have a crocodile, you have a dog, you have a bird, you have a snake, you have a hyena, you have what else? Forgot what the 6th one is. Yeah. The jackal? We've already talked about the jackal, the hyena. Anyway, you got 6 animals. Okay, if you tie them up with leashes, and you tie the leashes together, but you don't tie them to a post, the animals will pull each other in different directions, and whoever's strongest will pull the others away. Now in that group of animals, the crocodile is the strongest, so it's going to pull everybody down into the river and then they all drown. So to maintain your focus as you maintain sense restraint as you go through the day, the Buddha says you've got to have your mindfulness immersed in your body. In other words, stay with the breath. Make the breath comfortable. Make it a good place to stay so you're not so hungry to go out after what you see or hear or whatever. He says that's like tying all the leashes to a post. And this post is firm, then no matter how much the animals pull, they end up staying right next to the post. So again, you commit yourself to say, I've got to stay with my sense of the body, my sense of the breath energy in the body as I go through the day. And be careful about what would pull you out. Notice if greed is doing your looking or anger is doing your listening, you've got to say, no, I can't look in that way, I can't listen in that way. This is not to say you don't look or don't listen, but you have to change the motivation for looking or listening. And at the same time, you observe your mind. You protect your mind. You commit yourself to protecting your mind. And then you notice, you observe, okay, what's pulling it away? That's the reflection. It's in this way that your meditation develops momentum. So these two principles, commitment and reflection, start with very basic things, and they can go all the way to the end of the practice. So you get the mind into a state of concentration. Everything is very, very still. You ask yourself, is it really still? Is there any disturbance in there? Someone asked today what sutta I would recommend in the Sutta Pitaka. There's one, Majjhima 121, where the Buddha talks about getting the mind into concentration, and then asking yourself, is there still any disturbance in this concentration? We're not talking about disturbances outside, we're talking about disturbances in the concentration itself. And if you see that there's any activity in the mind that's not quite still, you let go. Anything that's not still, you let go. And you peel these things away. And this way your meditation develops, through committing yourself to doing it and then reflecting on the results. So this principle of commitment and reflection is what feeds the Dharma, all the way from very basic things like generosity, all the way up to putting an end to suffering. After all, this is how the Buddha himself found the way. And this is how we have to find the way for ourselves. Approaching the Dharma as a skill, realizing that our actions really do make a difference. One of the teachings that frustrates me most when I hear Dharma being taught, people say you have no free will, either because there's no you there to begin with, or your past karma determines everything. The Buddha never said that. You make use of your sense of self as an agent, and learn how to use your agency wisely. Years back, there was a psychologist who did a study of infant behavior. And he came to the conclusion that the things that make little babies happiest is when they do something repeatedly and they get the same results. Like they hit something and they get a noise. They hit it again, they get the same noise. They hit it again, they get the same noise. You've probably noticed this, it drives you crazy. But for them, it's they're figuring out cause and effect. And they realize, I'm an agent, I can make something happen in the world. And the Buddha's not saying, okay, don't go for your sense of agency, use your sense of agency, use it more wisely, don't just keep hitting and making noises. But use your sense of agency wisely so that you can see, if I do this, these are the results I get. Are they satisfactory? If not, how can I change? So you commit yourself to doing the best you can. Because if you don't do your best, you're not going to learn. Years back when I was teaching, before I ordained, I was teaching English in Chiang Mai University. And they had me teaching English literature. And I gave the students a book. I don't really have to go into the details about the book, but it was a difficult book. The narrator is telling a story, and the narrator was basically responsible for 2 suicides, but he doesn't want to let you know. So he jumps back and forth, back and forth, back and forth to sort of confuse the story. And so the book is all about the narrator. So I told the students about this, I laid out the timeline for what events that actually happened, tried to make it as easy as possible. But still, they found it hard. And one day, one of the women in the class said, Ajahn, why do you give us such difficult things to read? And I said, if I gave you easy things, what would you learn? And it was like that thought had never occurred to her before. A light bulb went off over her head, and she turned into an A student. So in the same way, the Buddha is challenging you, and he says, okay, stick by the 5 precepts. He's not saying that because the 5 precepts are easy, it's because they will challenge you. They make you more sensitive to the impact that your actions have on the world. They make you more sensitive to your own motivations. The whole point about a precept is you can break it only intentionally. So what are your intentions when you do something? What are your perceptions about things? Makes you more sensitive to your actions. That way, as you get more sensitive to your actions, you're prepared to start meditating. The same way as you're sensitive to what you're doing, trying to get the results as good as they can. Through this process of commitment to doing it well, and then reflecting on the results so you can do it better. This is called success by approximation. You work towards getting better and better and better. That's how you nourish the Dhamma. So that's how you take this faculty that we have, that we can make choices and we can have an impact on ourselves and on the world around us. We try to do it as well as we can. And this is why the Buddha taught 4 Noble Truths, not just one. There's a skillful path and there's an unskillful path. And you want to figure out the skillful path. He gives you directions, but at the same time, he challenges you. How do you actually put that into practice? He doesn't explain everything, because you're going to have to find out through your own actions, what's skillful and what's not. It's in this way that you develop the discernment that actually will help you see how you can put it into suffering. Because if the Buddha gave you a foolproof path, you'd still be a fool. The path has its challenges, and so you want to be up for the challenges, and it's through meeting the challenges that you become wise. So those are my thoughts for the evening. We have a little time for questions and answers.